The auction house on the Upper West Side of Manhattan had never looked more extravagant. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across a marble floor, polished to a mirror finish, and the air inside carried the faint mingling of aged leather, expensive cologne, and the particular kind of tension that only exists when vast sums of money are about to change hands. Rows of ultra-luxury vehicles sat beneath spotlights like sleeping animals, each one representing a level of wealth most people would never touch in a lifetime. Outside, black SUVs lined the curb 4 deep, their engines idling for owners who paid other people to wait. The guest list, read like the Forbes 5 to 100 index, brought to life hedge fund managers, tech founders, inherited dynasties, and the occasional foreign dignitary moving through the crowd with practiced grace. And at the center of all of it, flanked by 2 assistants and trailing a faint wake of turned heads and hushed whispers, walked Victoria Hale. She wore a charcoal column dress, her dark hair pulled back with surgical precision, and her expression carried the particular quality of someone who had spent years training themselves never to look impressed by anything. The press called her the Ice Queen, a nickname she neither confirmed nor denied, because engaging with it would have meant she cared about the people who used it. She didn't walk into rooms so much as she claimed them, the way a cold front claims a coastline not with drama, but with inevitability. The Rolls-Royce Phantom she had commissioned for the evening sat at the front of the display floor, its bodywork the color of deep ocean at midnight, and it was supposed to be the centerpiece of the charity portion of the auction. It was supposed to be many things that evening. What it actually became was something no one in that room had anticipated. 3 miles away, at a point in the city where the avenue numbers climbed high enough that the restaurants stopped being reviewed and the parking lots stopped being attended, a man named Daniel Carter was finishing the last of a bowl of oatmeal he had made at 4:58 in the morning because the timer on the coffee maker clicked at 5, and the smell always woke him before the alarm. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from actual labor rather than gym memberships, with the kind of face that had been weathered just enough to look trustworthy without looking worn out. He washed the bowl, dried it, put it back in the cabinet on the second shelf where it always went, and then padded down the short hallway to a door covered in hand-drawn crayon stars. He knocked once, softly. Inside, his daughter Emma, 8 years old, and a fierce believer in the negotiating power of exactly 5 more minutes, stirred beneath a comforter printed with cartoon planets. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment, he just watched her sleep, the way parents do when they believe no one is watching them be soft. He smoothed her hair back and said her name once, and she opened her eyes with the immediate, unguarded alertness of a child who has never had reason to wake up afraid. She asked if it was a school day. He told her it was. She asked if he had made oatmeal. He told her he had. She considered this information with the gravity of a small person who takes breakfast very seriously, then pushed herself upright and reached for her glasses on the nightstand. That was the beginning of Daniel Carter's Thursday. By 6:45, he had packed her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple slices, the little container of crackers she liked, walked her the 4 blocks to the school entrance on 73rd. Waited until she had pushed through the glass doors, and turned once to wave with her whole arm, and then begun the 12-minute walk back toward the garage. Carter's Auto on West 75th had been his father's shop before it was his. And before that, it had been a hardware store. And before that, something no one remembered. It was not a glamorous operation. The sign out front had 2 letters that no longer lit up at night. The hydraulic lift on Bay 2 had a slight drift that you had to account for. And the waiting room held 3 chairs, a coffee machine that worked, and a mounted television that received exactly 4 channels clearly. What the garage had, and what kept it full of work, was Daniel. His customers brought him cars they had given up on elsewhere. He had a reputation, not a loud one, not a marketed one, but the kind that travels person to person through the quiet channels of people who actually needed something fixed and had found someone who could actually fix it. He did not overcharge. He explained what he had done in language that did not make people feel stupid. He called when he said he would call. He had received, in the past year, 2 separate offers to join corporate diagnostic teams for dealerships that would have tripled his salary, and he had declined both of them because the hours would have required him to put Emma in extended care 5 days a week. And the calculus of that trade never came out in favor of the money. He had been a different man once, or perhaps a version of the same man operating in a different register, in his late 20s. Before Emma, before grief had come and rearranged his priorities with the bluntness of a natural disaster, he had worked for a precision engineering firm that contracted to 3 of the top 5 European automakers. He had been one of the youngest lead diagnosticians in the company's history. His supervisor at the time, a meticulous Austrian named Heinrich, who rarely praised anyone for anything, had once said in a performance review that Daniel possessed an instinct for mechanical systems that could not be taught and could only be wasted. That was before Daniel's wife, Claire, was diagnosed with the illness that took her in 14 months. He left the firm on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks after her funeral, cleared his desk with very little ceremony, and did not return to that world. What he returned to instead was the garage and Emma, and the particular kind of purpose that comes not from ambition but from love that has nowhere else to go. His regulars at the shop knew pieces of this story, Mrs. Fleming on the corner knew the most, because she had known his mother and brought him casseroles for a year after Claire died. But Daniel did not speak of it often because he was not a man who confused silence with suffering. The grief had become structural, built into the architecture of his life, the way a healed fracture becomes part of the bone. He carried it without complaint, because he had Emma, and Emma, as far as Daniel Carter was concerned, was the best argument against despair that the universe had ever produced. On that particular Thursday, he received a call at 9 in the morning from a logistics coordinator for the Lakeview Charity Auction Group, asking if he could provide on-site mechanical support that evening at the Meridian Event Center. They had a full technical team scheduled, but one of the members had called in sick, and they needed a qualified backup with luxury vehicle certification. The pay was reasonable, and the work was straightforward. So Daniel said yes, arranged for Emma to spend the evening with Mrs. Fleming 2 doors down, and at 6:30 that evening, arrived at the service entrance of the Meridian, carrying a compact toolkit and wearing clean dark trousers and a collared work shirt. He was shown to the technical staging area, handed a laminated pass that identified him as staff, and told to remain on standby near the display floor in case any of the vehicles needed attention before or during the presentations. He stood at the edge of the room and watched the guests arrive, and felt no particular envy or longing. The way a man who has made peace with his life tends not to feel envy at the lives of others. Victoria Hale arrived at 7:12, and the energy in the room shifted the way it always did when someone powerful entered a space, not dramatically, not with any single identifiable moment, but in the aggregate recalibration of 200 people, making small adjustments in her direction. She moved through the crowd, exchanging nods and handshakes with the precise economy of someone who has learned to perform warmth efficiently, and she took her position near the Phantom with the quiet, proprietary ease of a person who was used to being the most important presence in any room she occupied. The auction's first segment proceeded without incident. 3 vintage Ferraris moved for figures that the auctioneer announced with practiced escalating enthusiasm, and then it came time for the centerpiece. The lights shifted. The Phantom rolled forward on its display platform. The room gave it a round of appreciative murmurs. The auctioneer invited Victoria to start the vehicle as part of the presentation. She stepped forward, accepted the key from the event coordinator, and pressed the start button with the same unhurried confidence with which she signed acquisition documents. Nothing happened. She tried again. Nothing. The murmur in the room changed register. The event coordinator's smile became fixed and professional, in the specific way that smiles become when the person wearing them is experiencing silent panic. 3 members of the on-site technical team converged on the vehicle within 90 seconds. They plugged in diagnostic equipment. They checked connections. They conferred with each other in low voices that nonetheless did not carry the sound of people who had found the problem. Victoria's expression did not crack, but something behind her eyes went cold, and still in a way that her assistants recognized as a signal to stand back and give her space. 5 minutes passed. Then 8. The auctioneer made light conversation with the crowd. Someone in the second row checked their phone. It was at that moment that Victoria turned, scanning the room with the automatic, assessing gaze of a woman who was always looking for the next available solution, and her eyes landed on Daniel Carter standing at the far edge of the display floor. He was the only person in the room not wearing either a tuxedo or an event uniform. He was watching the technical team with his arms folded and his head tilted slightly, the posture of someone who has already identified the problem and is waiting politely for the professionals to arrive at the same conclusion on their own. Victoria stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then, in a voice pitched precisely loud enough to carry across the nearest 20 feet of crowd without quite being a shout, she said, "You, in the work shirt. If you can fix this car, I will marry you." The laughter that followed was immediate and generous, the well-lubricated laughter of wealthy people who had had several drinks and found the image of their immaculate CEO making a joke at her own expense genuine, charming. Someone in the third row actually applauded. Daniel unfolded his arms. He allowed himself one small, private smile, the kind that lives at one corner of the mouth and does not spread further, and then he walked toward the car. He did not ask the technical team to move. He simply approached the vehicle from the driver's side, crouched at the front wheel well for approximately 4 seconds, stood back up, moved to the rear of the car, knelt again, and was still for a moment in the particular way that skilled people are still when they are listening to something no one else can hear. He did not open the diagnostic tablet the technical team had left connected to the OBD port. He did not request tools. He reached into the inner edge of the rear bumper housing with 2 fingers, withdrew something small, examined it briefly with no change of expression, and placed it in his shirt pocket. Then he opened the driver's door, reached beneath the dash, made a single precise adjustment to something behind the fuse panel, and straightened up. "Try it now," he said to the event coordinator. She pressed the start button. The Rolls-Royce Phantom's engine turned over with the deep, composed authority of a machine that costs more than most people's homes, and the entire hall went silent for a fraction of a second before breaking into applause that was not the polite kind, but the involuntary kind, the applause that happens when something impossible has just been made ordinary. Victoria Hale was staring at Daniel Carter with an expression that, for perhaps the first time in a public setting, she had not consciously composed. It lasted only a moment. Then her face arranged itself back into its familiar geometry, and she said nothing, and Daniel Carter nodded once in the direction of the car, the way a craftsman nods at work that has been done correctly, and walked back to his position at the edge of the room. The item in his shirt pocket was small, roughly the size of a thick matchbook, matte black casing, with 2 contact points on one face that matched the configuration of the Phantom's secondary sensor bus. Daniel had seen something like it before, years ago, in a context that had nothing to do with charity auctions or luxury cars. He recognized it for what it was: a purpose-built inhibitor, not a commercial product. Not something you could order online, but something made by someone with specific technical knowledge and access to detailed schematics of the vehicle's electrical architecture. It had not been installed by accident. It had not been installed by someone who wanted to embarrass the charity. It had been installed by someone who specifically wanted to embarrass Victoria Hale, or worse, to disrupt something she cared about in a setting where she could not recover without visible loss of control. Daniel was not a dramatic man, and he did not leap to conclusions. But he was thorough, and he was, at his core, a person who did not like seeing the work of malicious hands go unexamined. He said nothing about it that evening. He finished his shift, collected his fee from the coordinator, and took the device home in his pocket. He spent 2 days thinking about it before doing anything further. During those 2 days, he changed oil on 3 vehicles, replaced a timing belt on a Honda, helped Mrs. Fleming figure out why her passenger window was making a grinding noise. It was a worn regulator clip, a 15-minute fix, and made Emma's favorite pasta on Friday night, the one with the butter and the Parmesan and the specific ratio of garlic that she had declared to be the correct amount after an extensive trial period the previous summer. He called an old contact named Ray, who had moved out of the corporate security world some years ago. and now ran a small firm that did technical due diligence for private clients. Ray was the kind of person who could look at a piece of hardware and tell you not only what it did, but who had the capability and the motivation to build it. Daniel described it over the phone, and then, with some hesitation, brought it to Ray's office in Brooklyn on Saturday afternoon. Ray turned the device over in his hands for a long time without speaking. When he finally spoke, he said that the manufacturing signatures in the casing and the circuit architecture were consistent with work he had seen before, from a small number internal fabrication lab, the kind that existed inside large technology companies as a black budget capability for proprietary security operations. He said he needed more time to be certain. He said Daniel should be careful. Daniel drove back to Manhattan, put the device in the metal box at the back of his parts cabinet, and the following Monday received an unexpected visitor at the garage. Victoria Hale arrived at Carter's Auto at 11:45 on Monday morning, in a car that was not her usual car, wearing clothes that were expensive but deliberately less conspicuous than her usual wardrobe, accompanied by one assistant rather than two. She stood in the doorway of the service bay for a moment, taking in the organized functionality of the space with an expression that was unreadable. And then she said, without preamble, "You took something from my car." It was not a question, and it was not an accusation in the legal sense. It was the statement of someone who had been piecing together a sequence of events and had arrived at a conclusion. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, folded the rag over the edge of the workbench, and said, "Yes." He retrieved the device from the parts cabinet and set it on the bench between them. Victoria looked at it, and something changed in her face, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, but a subtle shift in the arrangement of the lines around her eyes. The way a landscape shifts when a cloud passes over the sun. She reached for it, then stopped, and looked at Daniel. He said, "Someone installed it in your car, specifically to prevent it from starting at the event. Whoever did it knew the vehicle's electrical architecture in detail. That means they had access to internal documentation." Victoria did not respond immediately. She looked at the device for another moment, then looked at Daniel. And in the specific way of a person who has trained herself to trust almost no one, performed a rapid and thorough assessment of the man in front of her. What she saw was a garage, a workbench, crayon drawings pinned to a corkboard near the door, and a man who had driven a child to school that morning, to judge by the small pink backpack hanging on a hook by the entrance. She said, "Why didn't you go to the event security team that night?" Daniel said, "Because I didn't know who installed it, and until I did, I didn't know who I could trust." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Neither do I." That admission, arriving without theatrics, without self-pity, in the same tone she might have used to report a quarterly figure, was the first honest thing Victoria Hale had said to another person in longer than she could accurately remember. She had not intended to say it. It had come out because the man across the workbench from her had said something that was simply, uncomplicatedly true, and her defenses had not loaded fast enough to prevent her from responding in kind. She corrected the moment quickly, straightening, pulling her expression back to its professional arrangement, but the words were already in the air between them and both of them knew it. Daniel did not make anything of it. He did not lean in, did not show the particular attentiveness that people show when they sense vulnerability and want to exploit it. He simply said that he had a contact who could help identify the device's origin, and that he would share whatever Ray found. Victoria said that she would need to review it through her own channels. Daniel said that was fine. The conversation that should have ended there did not, because Victoria, who had come intending to retrieve the device and leave, found herself standing in a garage that smelled of motor oil and coffee and a child's crayon drawings, asking questions that had nothing to do with surveillance equipment. Ray confirmed his findings 3 days later. The device bore the fabrication signatures of a workshop that had operated, until 2 years ago, as a proprietary hardware lab within Hale Technologies' own corporate security division, a division that reported directly to the chief financial officer. The CFO was a man named Marcus Reed. He had been with the company for 11 years, Victoria had hired him herself, promoted him twice, and trusted his judgment on matters of capital allocation, with a confidence that she extended to very few people. Marcus was charming in the careful way of someone who has practiced being charming, intelligent about money in the way that masks intelligence about everything else. And he had been, for the entire duration of his tenure, conducting a slow and methodical campaign to position himself to seize control of the company. He had been cultivating relationships with two dissatisfied members of the board of directors for 14 months. He had entered into a side arrangement with a competing investment fund that stood to profit handsomely if Victoria's leadership was destabilized and a restructuring was forced. He had been instrumental in the selective leaking of internal documents that had caused 3 institutional shareholders to reduce their positions over the preceding quarter. And he had arranged, through the hardware lab that officially no longer existed, for a device to disable Victoria's car at a high-profile public event, a seemingly small humiliation that was nonetheless calculated to reinforce a narrative he had been quietly building, that Victoria Hale was losing her grip, that things were going wrong around her, that the ship needed new hands at the helm. What made Marcus's conspiracy so difficult to see from the inside was precisely how patient it was. He had not moved quickly. He had not made the amateur's mistake of reaching for too much, too soon. He had spent years accumulating small advantages, small favors, small debts, positioning himself in the architecture of the company the way ivy positions itself against stone, so gradually and so completely that by the time the damage is visible, it has already become structural. Victoria, reviewing the timeline with Daniel across the diner table on a Tuesday evening, found herself experiencing a specific kind of cold fury that was different from the sharp anger of being attacked. It was the deeper, slower anger of understanding that she had been watched and studied and mapped by someone she had given access to the most sensitive functions of everything she had built. Marcus had sat across from her in 100 board meetings and 100 dinners, and had looked her in the eye with the practiced sincerity of someone who has learned exactly how sincerity moves across a face, and had been, the entire time, working toward her removal. The picture assembled itself piece by piece over 10 days, as Daniel and Victoria worked through Ray's intelligence together, cross-referencing it against patterns in the company's internal data that Victoria was able to access and Daniel was able to interpret, because it turned out that his years in precision engineering had included substantial work on integrated electronic systems, and he could read a circuit diagram and a network traffic pattern with equal facility. During those 10 days, something else assembled itself, more slowly and less intentionally, in the hours that Daniel and Victoria spent across from each other at tables in the garage, at a diner on Amsterdam Avenue, where no one knew her face well enough to care, in the back office of Ray's Brooklyn building, when Ray was presenting his findings. Victoria had spent so long operating within the logic of transaction and advantage that she had nearly forgotten how to recognize a person who was not operating within that logic. Daniel was not helping her because he expected something. He was not helping her because he wanted access to her network or her capital or her influence. He appeared to be helping her because a piece of malicious hardware had turned up in his hands, and he was the kind of person who did not put a problem down until it was resolved. The simplicity of that motivation bewildered her at first. And then, gradually, it did something else. It settled her. She found herself saying things in the diner that she had not said to anyone in years about her father, who had built the first iteration of Hale Technologies out of a rented office in Cincinnati, and had died of a stroke at 61, 3 years before she had taken the company to its first billion in revenue. About the particular loneliness of a boardroom, where every person at the table was evaluating you in real time and would use anything you showed them as ammunition. About the way she had armored herself so thoroughly against being taken advantage of that she had, in the process, armored herself against most human warmth. She said these things in the matter-of-fact cadence of a woman delivering a status report, which was the only register in which she trusted herself to speak vulnerentially, and Daniel listened without performing sympathy, which was the only way she could have tolerated being listened to. He told her, in exchange, about Claire briefly. In the way that people who have processed grief speak about it, without the raw edges of people for whom it is still happening. He told her about the engineering firm in Europe, and the project he had abandoned, and the choice he had made, and the fact that he did not regret it, which was something he had told himself for years and had, by that point, come to mean entirely. Victoria had met many successful people who claimed not to regret the things they had given up. Daniel was the first one she believed. It was Emma who said the thing that Victoria could not stop thinking about afterward. The girl appeared in the doorway of the garage one afternoon when her school had let out early and Mrs. Fleming was not yet home, and Daniel had arranged for her to come directly to the shop after being buzzed in by the downstairs buzzer. She was 8 years old with her father's directness and her own particular brand of unstoppable curiosity, and she assessed Victoria with the frank, unhurried attention that children give to things they have not yet decided how to categorize. Victoria, who spoke to adult professionals with the ease of long practice and to small children with the stiff unfamiliarity of a person who had never spent much time around them, crouched down to Emma's level and said hello. Emma said hello back, and then studied Victoria's face for a moment with an expression of genuine puzzlement and said, "Why do you always look sad?" The question landed in Victoria's chest with the accuracy of something that had been aimed there all along. She opened her mouth and closed it again, and managed after a moment to say that she wasn't sad. She was just thinking about work. Emma considered this. She said, with the authority of someone who had given the matter real thought, "Daddy looks like that when he misses Mom. But then, I hug him, and he looks different." Then she went to find the crackers she knew her father kept in the top left cabinet, and left Victoria crouching by the workbench, blinking at the middle distance, with an expression that no photographer had ever captured, and that her board of directors had never seen. The danger sharpened in the week before the quarterly shareholders' meeting, when it became clear that Marcus had moved up his timeline. The leaks became more aggressive. A financial publication ran a story suggesting internal leadership tensions at Hale Technologies that it attributed to unnamed sources with direct knowledge of board deliberations language that could only have come from somewhere inside. Two of the institutional investors who had reduced their positions sent cooling communications to Victoria's office. And on a Tuesday night, when Daniel was working late on a transmission job after Emma was in bed, 3 individuals broke into the garage and damaged the hydraulic lift and overturned the parts cabinet and put a crack in the front window of the waiting room. It was destruction calibrated to be a message rather than a crime. Nothing was stolen. No structural damage was done to the building itself, and the surveillance camera on the exterior had been disabled 90 minutes before the break-in by someone who knew exactly where it was and what channel it transmitted on. Daniel filed a police report, fixed what could be fixed overnight, and said nothing to Emma about it in the morning. The message had been received. He was being warned to step back. What the people who sent that message did not understand, and what Victoria understood, increasingly, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, was that Daniel Carter was not the kind of man who calculated risk in terms of personal cost and then made the rational choice. He was the kind of man who identified what was right and then did it, not because he was incapable of fear, but because he had long ago learned the difference between things that mattered and things that could be replaced. A window could be replaced. A hydraulic lift could be repaired. Emma had not been touched, and the evidence was secure, and the work was not finished. That calculus was sufficient. He considered the warning with the same careful thoroughness he applied to every problem that came through his bay, and he concluded that stepping back was not the correct response. The following day he retrieved from a secure cloud backup the complete package of documentation he and Ray had assembled over the preceding 2 weeks. Marcus's communications with the rival investment fund, obtained through a whistleblower inside that fund who had his own grievances, the financial records that showed the pattern of coordinated share movement, the hardware provenance report on the inhibitor device, and the testimony of a junior attorney at Marcus's legal firm who had been asked to draft certain documents that, when he understood their purpose, had declined and kept copies. The package was thorough. It was, Daniel thought, more than enough. The morning of the shareholders' meeting was clear and cold, the kind of November morning in Manhattan that has a hard light to it. As if the city is being held up to scrutiny, Victoria arrived at the Meridian Conference Center, the same building in which this whole sequence had begun, with her spine straight and her expression composed, and a quiet terror moving beneath her sternum that she had managed, through long practice, to convert into a kind of forward momentum. The boardroom filled. The institutional shareholders dialed into the video conference feed. Marcus Reed arrived looking exactly like what he was trying to look like. Calm, reasonable, the competent steadying hand. He opened the session by requesting an emergency vote of no confidence in the current executive leadership, citing a prepared list of operational failures and strategic missteps that had been, as Victoria now knew, either manufactured or engineered by him. He was thorough and convincing, and he spoke with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed the argument for months. Several heads around the table nodded. Victoria was aware that she was watching a performance she had not known was being rehearsed in rooms she had trusted. She let him finish. Then she said she had a presentation she needed the room to see before any vote was taken, and she pressed a key on the laptop before her, and the screen at the end of the table lit up, and Daniel Carter walked in through the boardroom door. He was wearing the same clean dark trousers and collared shirt he had worn at the auction. He carried a hard drive and a printed report, and the same quiet confidence of a man who has checked his work and found it correct. He stood at the end of the table, and he presented what they had found, without editorial, without drama, in the methodical and precise cadence of a man who had once compiled technical reports for international engineering review boards. He showed the communications, he showed the financial records, he showed the hardware provenance report, and played a short audio recording obtained legally, with Ray's professional guidance of a phone call in which Marcus discussed the share manipulation strategy with his contact at the rival fund. He showed the documents the junior attorney had preserved. He was done in 14 minutes. For approximately 30 seconds after he finished, the boardroom was entirely silent. Then the chairman of the board, a 70-year-old man named Gerald, who had known Victoria's father and who had been growing quietly uneasy with Marcus's behavior for 6 months, without being able to articulate why, looked down the table at Marcus Reed and said, very quietly, "I think we need to pause this meeting." Security was called. The general counsel of the company, who had not been part of Marcus's conspiracy and whose loyalty proved to be entirely genuine, initiated the emergency protocol. Marcus Reed was escorted from the building before the video conference feed was terminated. The vote of no confidence was not taken. What was taken, instead, was a long, collective breath by everyone in the room who had been managing uncertainty for months and had not known why things felt wrong. Victoria sat at the head of the table for a moment after the room began to clear, and she looked at Daniel, standing near the doorway with the hard drive and the printed report, and the expression of a man who is simply glad the job is done, and she felt something she had not felt inside a corporate building in longer than she could name. She felt safe. The weeks after the shareholders' meeting were full of the hard, structural work of repair legal proceedings, regulatory notifications, the careful management of shareholder communications that had to acknowledge the breach without compounding the damage. Victoria worked harder than she had in years, not from the driven desperation that had been fueling her before, but from the steadier energy of someone who has identified the actual threat and eliminated it. She slept better. Her executive team noticed a change in her that they described to each other, carefully and with the slight amazement of people who had adjusted to a less forgiving version of her, as something like ease. She called Daniel more than she intended to, initially under the formal pretext of updating him on the legal proceedings as a material witness, and then with decreasing pretext as the weeks went on, until one evening she called him without any pretext at all, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential, while Emma did homework at the kitchen table in the background and periodically asked her father to confirm that 7 times 8 was 56. Victoria began to understand, in the slow way that understanding comes when it has traveled a long distance, that the thing she had been defending herself against for so long was not exploitation or betrayal in the abstract. It was the specific and particular pain of caring about someone and discovering that the caring was not returned. Every protection she had been built against that experience, and what those protections had cost her was the exact thing they were meant to preserve: the capacity to be known by another person and to know them in return. Daniel Carter, who had walked into an auction hall in a work shirt and fixed a car that someone had broken and pocketed a piece of evidence that led to the unraveling of a conspiracy he had no obligation to pursue, was the first person in a long time who had not asked her for anything. And in not asking for anything, he had somehow given her back the ability to want to offer something. The charity vehicle exhibition she organized 4 months later was Emma's idea. Actually, or rather, Emma had said during one of the evenings she had begun spending at Victoria's apartment learning to play chess, that she thought it would be nice if there were a party with pretty cars that helped people. And Victoria, who had discovered that Emma's ideas arrived in the casual, obvious form of things that were simply correct, had agreed. The Lakeview exhibition for Children's Hospital Research was held on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, in the same Meridian Event Center, and it was quieter and warmer than the original auction, and filled with people who had come genuinely rather than performatively. The vehicles on display included several from collectors who had donated them at cost, and 2 of Daniel's restorations: a 1967 Ford Mustang and a 1972 Dodge Charger that he had rebuilt over the course of years with the patient devotion that is a form of love which Victoria had managed to get included in the program by simply asking him, and by being prepared, for the first time in a long time, to hear yes. She waited until the room was full, and the afternoon light was coming through the event center's high windows at the precise angle that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is, and she walked to the small stage area at the front of the room and asked for a moment of everyone's attention. The room gathered itself toward her in the way rooms do when someone of her presence speaks, and she let the quiet settle, and then she said, she needed to tell them something. She said that approximately 4 months ago, at an event very much like this one but considerably less pleasant in its outcome, she had made a statement that she had not, she would now confess, intended as a serious commitment. The room stirred with the beginning of recognition. She said that she had told a man in a work shirt that if he fixed her car, she would marry him. She paused. She said he had fixed the car. Laughter moved through the room, easy and warm, the laughter of people who were already fond of where this was going. She said that she had, since that evening, also discovered that the man in question had identified a corporate conspiracy, preserved the evidence of it at personal risk, sat across a diner table from her on 4 separate occasions while she talked about her father, taught her the correct ratio of garlic for butter pasta, and had a daughter who had, in a single question, accomplished what 4 years of executive coaching had failed to do, which was to make her stop performing and start being present. She turned to where Daniel was standing at the edge of the room, with his hands in his pockets, and the particular expression of a man who has been surprised by something and is trying to decide how to arrange his face. She said, "I have not kept my promise." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and withdrew a ring, not a dramatic thing, not an architectural statement, but a simple band with a single inlaid stone, the exact color of the sea on an overcast day, chosen because Emma had pointed at it in the window of a jeweler on Lexington Avenue 2 weeks prior, and said with absolute certainty that it was the right one. Victoria stepped down from the stage. She crossed the floor. She stood in front of Daniel Carter, and she did something that she could not have imagined herself doing in any version of her life she had planned, and she lowered herself to one knee on the polished concrete floor of the Meridian Event Center in front of 200 people, and she looked up at him and said, "You fixed more than the car. Will you let me keep you around permanently?" There was a silence in the room that had nothing performative in it, the genuine silence of people who are watching something real unfold in front of them and understand that they should not interrupt it. Daniel looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been solving a problem for a long time and has just arrived at the solution and is taking one quiet beat to confirm that it is correct. Then he reached down and took her hand and helped her to her feet and said, "Yes." And from somewhere to his left, moving at the full speed of an 8-year-old, who had been waiting for this moment with considerably less patience than either of the adults involved, Emma Carter crossed the room in approximately 4 strides and embedded herself in the space between the 2 of them with both arms extended, and the 3 of them stood together in the middle of the exhibition floor, while the room around them filled with applause that was not the obligatory kind, not the well-lubricated kind, but the involuntary kind, the kind that happens when something impossible has just been made ordinary. In the months that followed, people who had watched Victoria Hale in professional settings for years would notice the change without being able to fully articulate it. She was no less precise, no less effective, no less formidable, when formidability was required. But there was something different in the quality of her presence in a room, a groundedness that had not been there before, the quality of a person who has somewhere solid to return to. She laughed more readily. She asked her team questions she already knew the answers to, because she had remembered that the point of asking questions was not always to obtain information. She began leaving the office at 6:30 with a regularity that her executive assistant marked privately as one of the most significant operational developments of the year. Daniel's garage took on 2 additional technicians and moved to a larger bay space on 74th, and his restoration work began attracting attention from collectors who heard about the Mustang and the Charger and came to look and stayed to talk, and eventually left cars and came back for them months later, having told 3 other people. Emma turned 9 in April and demanded a birthday party with a theme she described as cars and space combined. And Victoria, who was discovering that the specific creative demands of a 9-year-old were among the more interesting problem-solving challenges she had encountered, delivered it with assistance from the garage team and a particular dedication that Emma later described to her 3rd-grade class as the best party in history. Probably, the detail that Emma chose to include in the class presentation with the unsentimental factual confidence of a child reporting observable data was that her dad smiled more now. She said this not because she thought it was important to say, but because it was true. And Emma Carter was, in this, as in all things, her father's daughter. She did not confuse silence with suffering, and she did not confuse happiness with noise. She simply noted what was, and trusted that it was enough. There is a particular idea that circulates in the world of the very successful, a piece of received wisdom about the relationship between achievement and connection, which holds that the two are fundamentally in tension, that the pursuit of one requires the sacrifice of the other, that the person who builds something truly significant must be, at some essential level, alone. Victoria Hale had lived inside that idea for the better part of 15 years. She had taken it as a structural, given, the way you take gravity as a structural, given not as a choice, but as the terms of the world. What she discovered, through a sequence of events that had begun with a broken car and a throwaway line and a man in a work shirt who took a piece of evidence home in his pocket because it was the right thing to do, was that the idea was simply wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in some cases, not wrong for certain kinds of people, wrong in the way that a load-bearing assumption can be wrong, such that when it is removed, the entire structure has to be rebuilt from a different foundation, and the rebuilt structure turns out to be stronger than the one it replaced. She had built her empire believing that the price of building it was isolation, and she had paid that price without question, because she did not know there was another way to pay. Daniel Carter had not shown her another way by explaining it, or arguing for it, or offering it as an alternative theory. He had simply been, in every interaction they had from the auction floor to the shareholders' meeting, to the diner on Amsterdam Avenue, a person who was exactly what he appeared to be, and in a world where Victoria had spent years learning to read the gap between appearance and reality, the absence of that gap was the most disorienting, and ultimately the most valuable thing she had ever encountered. For his part, Daniel never spoke about what he had done as though it had been remarkable. When people at the garage asked him, obliquely, how it was that he had ended up in the middle of a corporate espionage case and a shareholder battle and a boardroom confrontation, he would say something brief and accurate about how a piece of hardware had come into his hands, and he had followed it to where it led. He had not been looking for adventure, or recognition, or reward. He had been doing what he had always done, which was to take the thing in front of him seriously enough to see it through. That quality, the quality of full attention given to the task at hand, without reservation, without the constant mental reservation of whether it was worth it, was the thing that Emma had grown up watching in him and had absorbed without knowing she had absorbed it, and it was the thing that Victoria had recognized, at a level below language, as the first genuinely trustworthy signal she had encountered in a very long time. The three of them, the mechanic and the CEO and the girl who had asked the right question at the right moment had, through no particular plan and no particular design, found in each other something that all three of them had been quietly, persistently missing. And in the way of things that are genuinely good, it did not announce itself. It simply became true and kept being true. One ordinary morning at a time. The most precious things in a life are rarely the things that arrive in the moments of your greatest triumph. They are not the ones who appear when your car starts, and your stock is rising, and your name is on the front page in favorable terms. They are the ones who are still there when the car won't start, and the conspiracy has been laid bare, and the thing you have spent your life building is 3 votes away from being taken from you. They are the ones who fix what is broken and pocket the evidence, and do not ask for anything in return except perhaps the occasional correct ratio of garlic. And who have daughters who ask the right questions at the right moment, and who smile differently now not because the world has become simpler, but because they have found, in the middle of the ordinary machinery of daily life, the one other person for whom they were apparently always the solution.